Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, the Battle of Borodino 1812. Without further ado, let's go.
This Epic History TV video is brought to you by Magellan TV, the documentary streaming service.
Of all my 50 battles, the most terrible one was the one I fought at Borodino. That's quite a statement from Napoleon, considering how much death and destruction he has seen throughout his career.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history. September 1812. 10 weeks had passed since Napoleon invaded Russia with more than 500,000 men.
And remember, his initial plan called for 5 weeks of action.
The French Emperor wanted a quick victory over the Russians, one that would force Emperor Alexander to make peace and agree to French terms. But at Vitebsk and then Smolensk, the outnumbered Russian army had narrowly escaped his clutches. The holy city of Smolensk had been virtually destroyed. Napoleon had advanced deep into Russia, and months of marching had left his army decimated by disease and exhaustion. It was now half its original strength, and summer was nearly over. But finally, 70 miles west of Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russians had turned to offer battle. Napoleon would have a chance to win the decisive victory that he believed would end the war.
Soldiers, here's the battle you have so long desired. Henceforth victory depends on you. Napoleon's proclamation to the army on the eve of battle. I'm not so sure how many of those soldiers have long desired it, this battle. But, you know, it's inspiring, I guess.
The Russian army, commanded by the 67-year-old one-eyed veteran General Kutuzov, occupied a defensive position across the two main roads leading from Smolensk to Moscow. General Barclay de Tolly's First Army was on the right, its front protected by the Kalatsha River, steep-banked but shallow and easily forded.
Yes, and already here we can see problems with the Russian disposition. Now, Kutuzov's thinking was that Napoleon was going to come from the new Smolensk road, and thus he placed Barclay's army, which was the largest and strongest one. He placed the First Western Army in front of the Kalatsha River, and this was a virtually unassailable position. Most of the Russian artillery was concentrated here, and most of the men were concentrated here. And yeah, this is a problem because Napoleon was never going to attack from this direction. He would instantly see that this position was too heavily fortified.
Prince Bagration's Second Army was on the left, a more open position but reinforced by major earthworks.
Yes, Barclay's army was much smaller, and the terrain where Prince Bagration's army was stationed did not offer much defensiveness at all. The only advantage he really had was the thick woods, but other than that, it was a pretty open position, and he was undermanned, and he didn't have enough guns, really. to defend this position.
The Great Redoubt, and what the French nicknamed for their shape, the flèche, the arrows.
Yes, the redoubt was intended to strengthen this otherwise open position, and it was a prudent move, though by all reports these fortifications were not that satisfactory as it could have been, and well, that would make it easier, of course, for the French to overtake these defenses.
Another forward redoubt at Borodino was expected to delay the enemy's advance. Historians still dispute the size of the Russian army, but it's likely Kutuzov had around 121,000 men and 680 guns at Borodino. On the 5th of September, Napoleon's army began to arrive from the west. Around 130,000 men and 585 guns. Napoleon quickly saw that the Borodino redoubt would have to be taken before he could deploy his army, and ordered an immediate assault. The attack was led by Compan's 5th Division of the 1st Corps, supported by the Polish 5th Corps to the south. In several hours of heavy fighting, the redoubt changed hands more than once. But late that evening, the Russians finally withdrew to their main line, and the redoubt fell to the French. Its capture had cost them an estimated 4,000 casualties, while the Russians lost around 6,000 men.
That's an insane number for just one redoubt, and that is a testament to the ferocity of the fighting.
Napoleon noted how few prisoners were taken, a worrying sign of the enemy's unbroken resolve. Both sides spent the next day preparing for battle.
Yes, and at this point, I believe that many of the Russian generals, including Bagration himself, pleaded with Kutuzov to redeploy some of the forces on the right wing to reinforce the left flank here. And because it was obvious at this point, the main thrust was going to come from on the left flank of the Russians. And despite these pleas, none of the troops were redeployed there until much later during the battle.
Marshal Davout, commanding French 1st Corps and widely considered Napoleon's most able subordinate, appealed to the Emperor to use his corps to make a wide outflanking attack to the south. But Napoleon dismissed the idea as too risky.
Yes, and I could see reasons for why Napoleon would think it was too risky. One is the fact that this outflanking maneuver would have to be performed through the thick woods on the Russian left flank. The other reason, of course, moving an army through thick woods poses a number of problems, including the fact that it could get bogged down by skirmishes and whatnot. And even if Davout did succeed, there was a risk that the Russians would call it quits and basically retreat again. And that is something Napoleon did not want. So instead, by opting for a frontal assault, he would pin the Russians in place, making sure that they did not leave and retreat once more like they did at Smolensk. But in reality, Davout's suggestion was probably a good one, and it would have saved a lot of French lives, probably. You never know how these things would have developed. Instead, he did opt for some flanking maneuver, but that was left to Poniatowski's relatively weak Polish corps, and they would also have trouble fighting through the woods.
And instead began preparing for a massive frontal assault on the Russian defenses.
could not escape the feeling that something huge and destructive was hanging over all of us. Captain von Linsingen, 2nd Westphalian Light Battalion. Yeah, sometimes you just get those gut feelings that something ain't right, and this is not gonna turn out well.
Shortly after dawn on the 7th of September, Orthodox priests paraded one of Russia's holiest icons, Our Lady of Smolensk, before the Russian army. It was a stirring sight for many devout Russian soldiers, thousands of whom would not live to see dusk. The battle began at 6 a.m. as French batteries opened a deafening cannonade against the Russian defenses. Eugene's 4th Corps advanced on Borodino village, lightly held by Jaegers of the Russian Imperial Guard. After clearing the village, his infantry crossed the Kalacha and advanced towards the Great Redoubt, but were driven back with heavy losses. The Russians burned the bridge across the river, but did not launch a counterattack, and Eugene was able to move cannon into the village to put flanking fire on the Great Redoubt. In the center, Davout's 1st Corps began its advance against the Fleches, coming under heavy fire. While on the right, the Polish 5th Corps, ordered to take Kutuzov, got held up in the woods and ravines. Their slow advance allowed Tushkov's 3rd Corps to send a division north to reinforce the Fleche defenses. Kutuzov, at his headquarters in Gorky, took little part in the battle.
Yeah, you could say that. Kutuzov was very hands-off in this battle, and that was both good and bad, I suppose. It's bad because with Kutuzov's command, they could have organized a better defense for Bagration's left flank in time before the battle, but that did not happen. But this also meant that Bagration and Barclay were free to act on their own, and that's what they will do.
Leaving tactical decisions to his subordinates. Barclay and Bagration had spent most of the summer arguing furiously over strategy, but in the hour of crisis, they put their differences aside. They could see the main French attack was falling on the Russian center and left. So Barclay ordered General Bagavout's 2nd Corps south to reinforce Bagration.
Yes, at this point, Bagration bypassed Kutuzov and went directly to Barclay to appeal for aid, even though they kind of hated each other. And Bagration, or rather, Barclay heeded this request and immediately sent reinforcements to assist Bagration, which is exactly what they should have done before all of this. But better late than never, I suppose.
Fighting around the Fleche intensified as the French captured one of the earthworks, only to be driven out by a Russian counterattack. Davout himself was injured in the fighting as he fell from his dying horse, but he refused to leave the field.
Yes, Davout was actually reported as dead by General Sorbier, I believe. And Napoleon sent General Rapp, his eternal fixer and bodyguard and longtime aide, to take over command, only to find Davout very much alive, leading the attack.
When Russian cavalry counterattacked, Marshal Murat himself led the French cavalry forward to meet them. Ney's 3rd Corps now joined the attack on the Fleche. A charge by Russian cuirassiers forced Murat to take shelter in a square of Württemberg infantry. Murat, with his flamboyant dress and reckless courage, had now even made a name for himself among the Russians. The Cossacks in particular saw him as a kindred spirit and were eager to capture him alive if they could.
Typical Murat.
To the south, Polish troops now took Kutuzov, which the Russians set ablaze before withdrawing. But General Bagavut's reinforcements arrived just in time to shore up the Russian flank. Around 10 a.m., Eugène launched another attack on the Great Redoubt. It was briefly captured by Morand's 1st Division, before his men were thrown out by a ferocious Russian counterattack. The Russian army's 27-year-old artillery commander, General Kutuzov, was killed leading one of these counterattacks. A heroic death, but a blow to the organization of Russian artillery for the rest of the day.
Yes, General Kutuzov was the chief of the artillery, and his death meant that much of the Russian artillery was left in the rear and was never brought forward into action, while at the same time the French are bringing up more and more cannons to just hammer the Russians into pieces. So this was a great blow for the Russians during this battle.
Fighting continued to rage around the Flèche earthworks. Some counted as many as 6 major French assaults, involving 45,000 troops, with hundreds of cannon on both sides, pouring fire into the packed ranks.
Can you imagine that scene playing up right in front of you? I mean, just to be an observer of this battle, what a stunning, bloody masterpiece it would have been. Yeah. Really hard to imagine so many people fighting each other, concentrated on such a small area, relatively speaking.
More than once, French infantry fought their way into one of the Russian positions, only to be driven out again at bayonet point. Junot's Westphalian Corps was sent forward in support, helping to clear Russian skirmishers from the woods to the south. General Bagration was close to the action, overseeing the defense of the Flèche, leading forward reinforcements and ordering counterattacks. Around 10 a.m., he was hit in the leg by shell fragments. Mortally wounded, he was carried from the field.
The death of General Bagration, or the mortally wounded Bagration at this point, was a huge blow to the Second Army's morale, and after this, they basically shattered, allowing the French to seize control of the Flèche.
Shaken by the loss of their iconic commander, the exhausted Russian infantry began to fall back. The French finally took the Flèche. Marshal Murat then led forward Friant's division, First Corps' last reserve, supported by waves of heavy cavalry on both flanks. Russian grenadiers formed squares to ward off the French cuirassiers, while their own guard cavalry fought the French in a giant confused melee, with heavy losses on both sides.
The absolute chaos that's going on.
The Russians resisted doggedly, but the combined onslaught of French artillery, cavalry, and infantry proved irresistible. As the Russians pulled back, Friant's infantry fought their way into the village of Semyenovskaya. The Russian center was in disarray and seemed close to breaking. Surely now was the time for Napoleon to deliver the knockout blow.
Soldiers, face to the enemy. Let's go and get killed. French colonel to his men at Borodino. Yeah, taken in this out of context like this, it might seem like a strange thing to say to your soldiers, but basically, this is supposed to be more of an inspiring thing. At the heat of the moment, it would have just riled the men up.
For most of the day, Napoleon remained at his headquarters near Borodino. Those around him later said that illness, as well as the exertions of the long campaign, had left him tired and irritable. As the Russian center buckled, Murat and his staff urged him to send forward his last reserve, the Imperial Guard. The Emperor refused. If there is another battle tomorrow, he asked them, where is my army?
Yes, Napoleon's decision not to send in the Imperial Guard at this stage of the battle has been controversial ever since. It has been discussed endlessly by Napoleonic historians. And, well, I could see both sides of the argument. Now, we have to remember that Napoleon was probably sick with a cold or something the like at this point, and he was pretty far away from the battlefield. He couldn't really see what was going on at the front. And so he really didn't have enough information to base that decision on. But even then, the Imperial Guard was his last reserve that was intact, and was very far away from France. There was no prospect of reinforcements anytime soon. And so keeping this reserve intact could be seen as a very prudent but guarded move. However, on the other side, it is clear that the Guard could have made a great difference in totally breaking the Russian army here. And maybe that could have led to the total destruction of Kutuzov's army, which could have forced Alexander into a peace agreement. But yeah, historians, like I said, the historians have debated this endlessly, and there really isn't a consensus as far as I can see. I'm more inclined to lean on Napoleon's reasoning, and the Imperial Guard would prove very important later on. And we have to make clear here that sending in the Guard at this point would have left a lot of guardsmen dead. So this reserve proved very useful in the retreat. But yeah, we can discuss this. If you have an opinion on this, please leave a comment. But yeah, this is a controversial decision, as I said.
But he did make one exception. Barclay was continuing to move troops from his unengaged right wing to bolster the center. As Osterman Tolstoy's 4th Corps arrived behind the Russian center, French observers feared they were massing for an attack. So Napoleon ordered forward General Sorbier's Guard artillery. His batteries opened a devastating fire on the enemy. Yet even as they were mown down in their ranks, the Russian infantry stood their ground. On the Russian right wing, all remained quiet, so General Platov...
You can see how many troops... the Russians have basically moved Barclay's entire army off from their right flank and to reinforce Bagration's position, or what was Bagration's position. And this really reinforces my reasoning that the Russian deployment was very inefficient and could have ensured a much easier time for the Russians. They maybe could have won the battle if they had all the troops there in place before the battle started.
Commander of the Don Cossacks proposed that he lead an attack on the lightly defended Borodino village. Permission received, Generals Platov and Uvarov led a force of 8,000 Cossacks and cavalry.
Yes, this is a famous little raid that went on during the Battle of Borodino. They went to Kutuzov with this plan, and he just said yes. He didn't really ask for specifics or draw up any plans, and that's the problem with this raid, as we will see. There were no objectives, no clear objectives. They didn't really know what they were supposed to do, and they had no infantry support, and I believe only 12 artillery with them. And so cavalry forces without infantry support are not very useful, I would say. Nothing to follow up. So it was seen by many Russians, including Kutuzov, as more of a feint than an actual, attempt to outflank and destroy Eugene's position at Borodino.
Across the Kalacha River. They They fell on French and Italian troops around Borodino with complete surprise, spreading panic and disorder. Grouchy's 3rd Cavalry Corps had to be pulled back across the river to drive off the Russians. Russian commanders saw this raid as a missed opportunity, but it had delayed the next French attack by 2 hours.
And this was very consequential for the outcome of the battle. Even though the raid was largely a failure, it had delayed Eugene's attack by 2 hours, which allowed the Russian forces to redeploy and strengthen their lines to face off the main French attack.
And may have persuaded Napoleon that he was right to hold back his reserve.
I had never seen such carnage. General Rapp, Napoleon's aide-de-camp, wounded for the 22nd time at Borodino. This man had taken so many wounds, he almost rivaled Marshal Oudinot.
Around 3 p.m., the French launched their biggest assault yet on the Great Redoubt. Russian gunners targeted the French infantry advancing to their front, allowing French cavalry to outflank the redoubt and charge it from the rear. Saxon cavalry were first in, cutting down Russian infantry and gunners almost to the last man. It was an astonishing feat by the horsemen, against all the rules of war, and testament to the ferocity of the fighting.
And when they say against all the rules of war, they mean it in the context that cavalry was not supposed to charge fortified defensive positions. And that's what they did, and they succeeded. And by succeeding, they spread much panic and disorder in the Russian defenses, which allowed the infantry to move forward and seize the defensive works.
As Eugene's infantry consolidated their hold on the redoubt, he ordered forward all the available cavalry to exploit this success. But they were met and checked by the last Russian cavalry reserves. Eugene now implored Napoleon to commit the Imperial Guard. But again, the Emperor refused. "I will not destroy my guard," he told his staff. "I am 800 leagues from France, and I will not risk my last reserve."
Yes, and another factor playing into this whole preserving the guard theme is the fact that Napoleon was always very, very careful about deploying his guard. And it wasn't really until 1814 that he started using it regularly. And so, yeah, this is an ongoing theme that was not really surprising.
By 5 p.m., both armies were in a state of utter exhaustion. The battlefield was strewn with dead and wounded. Some infantry battalions could muster only a third of their strength. Cavalry could advance no faster than a trot. Gun crews were collapsing with fatigue. As dusk approached, fighting slowly died out across the battlefield. Napoleon and the French army expected the fighting to resume the next day. But by dawn, Kutuzov, having learned the full, horrifying scale of Russian losses, had ordered a withdrawal. The losses on both sides were enormous. Russian casualties are estimated at 44,000. French losses around 30,000, including 49 generals, 12 of them killed.
And this was 1 day's worth of fighting. Not 2, not 3, not 4, 1.
Borodino would prove to be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian army could not fight another battle until it had received major reinforcements.
Yes, Kutuzov actually, I believe he planned to make a final stand outside Moscow, but after discussing with his generals and discussing the various options, they decided that the Russians had simply not received enough reinforcements to hold off the French, and they decided to just retreat beyond Moscow and give up the city. There was no other option at this point.
And so Kutuzov decided that he must abandon Moscow. On the 15th of September, a week after his victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered the city. He would find it virtually deserted, and already the first fires starting to burn.
Alright, that's the end of Napoleon's bloodiest day, the Battle of Borodino, 1812. A very costly victory for Napoleon, what we would call the Pyrrhic victory, which, although it allowed him to take Moscow, would ultimately not change the strategic outcome of the war. But yeah, that was this video, another great video from Epic History TV. And as usual, if you have any comments to add additional context, please leave them. I will read them and respond. And if you like the video, leave a like and subscribe. You know the drill. So I'll see you guys next time.